Welcome everybody to the channel. I'm Aaron. Today, I came across a very noteworthy assessment from Colonel Douglas MacGregor, someone whose name is likely already familiar to many viewers who follow military affairs and geopolitics in the United States. Now, he argues that the story between United States and Iran may not be over yet. In his view, the possibility that President Trump may continue ordering strikes on Iran in the near future cannot be ruled out at all.
I was a bit surprised by it.
Well, I think on Monday, what will happen when the ceasefire ends, if not before, but I think it'll be Monday, you're going to see what I think Trump hopes will be the final solution for Iran. You'll see a massive air and missile attack. Solution for Iran. You'll see a massive air and missile attack. And that massive air and missile attack will last in terms of intensity for several days. Now we're bringing more there. So that's why I say this next round of strikes that will begin next week are designed to be the final solution for Iran, to utterly obliterate the country.
This is an assessment that deserves close analysis, because if that really happens, it will not simply be an isolated military escalation. It could trigger a wide range of major consequences, from security in the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz, and global oil prices, to the strategic position of the United States across the entire region. Now, what stands out in MacGregor's argument is that he does not believe the United States would choose a scenario involving a large-scale ground invasion of Iran. According to him, a far more realistic and also far more dangerous option would be a heavy air campaign, striking from a distance, using missiles and air superiority to pressure Tehran. Now, if that is true, then the ceasefire we are seeing may not yet be a sign of lasting de-escalation. It may only be a short pause between two more intense phases of tension. And that is why, in today's video, we are going to break down Douglas MacGregor's assessment. Why does he believe the risk of the United States attacking Iran again is real? Why does he believe a ground war is almost impossible? And if Washington truly chooses the path of further escalation, who will be the first to pay the price? Who will be pulled into this vortex, and who may ultimately benefit in the long run? So let's begin. To understand why Douglas MacGregor believes Trump would soon attack Iran again, we must take a look at the ceasefire the way he does. For many people, a ceasefire means a de-escalation. It creates the impression that both sides have seen the limits, both have understood the price of escalation, and both are now searching for a way out. But MacGregor does not read the situation that way. In his logic, the current ceasefire is not a genuine sign of real restraint.
Not for a ceasefire. Well, we had to bring in more firepower. We had to bring in more ammunition. We had to bring in more missiles. We wanted to bring in more Marines and airborne troopers, ostensibly for the purpose that you were discussing earlier, seizing some islands or maybe some other points on the ground, or to fly around Iran looking for enriched uranium.
It more looks like a technical pause, a temporary break to reorganize forces, assess damage, replenish firepower, and prepare for the next move.
Night a week ago, he would have come out and said, I've given a lot of thought to what we've done, and I can't go any further. Military power is the wrong instrument to solve this problem. So I am disengaging our forces from active combat against Iran. We are going to seek out intermediaries that can bring us together and hopefully find a resolution. Well, why didn't he do that? Because he is hostage to Israeli demands and to the demands that Israel's agents in the United States are making. And their demand is very straightforward.
In other words, according to MacGregor, what the world is seeing is not the end of the crisis, but may simply be a transition scene between two rounds of escalation.
Out to do what? Destroy Iran. Well, we discovered we didn't have enough to do that. Now we're bringing more there.
Now, this is an extremely important point, because if a ceasefire appears after the core military and political objectives have been basically achieved, then people have reason to believe it is a sign of de-escalation. But if a ceasefire appears while the core objectives still have not been realized, then it takes on a completely different meaning. It is no longer an ending. It is only a pause. And MacGregor believes the current case falls into that second category. According to him, the previous US strike did not achieve what the people pushing this campaign had hoped for. If Washington had once believed that hitting hard enough and fast enough would shock Iran, paralyze it, push it into internal chaos, or force it into a passive retreat, then reality did not unfold that way. Iran did not collapse. The state apparatus did not break. Iranian society did not fall apart after only a few days of bombardment. And most importantly, Tehran's deterrent capability was not cleanly erased the way many had imagined.
That this would be short, sharp, and decisive. That after a few days, the regime would collapse and everything would fall like ripe fruit into his lap. Well, that turned out to be wrong. So suddenly he was compelled to start a continuous bombing campaign. That failed. And so we opted for a ceasefire. Why did we opt for a ceasefire? Well, we had to bring in more firepower. We had to bring in more ammunition. We had to bring in more missiles. We wanted to bring in more Marines and airborne troopers, ostensibly for the purpose that you were discussing earlier, seizing some islands or maybe some other points on the ground, or to fly around Iran looking for enriched uranium. I don't know. That didn't go very well the last time we tried it. The bottom line is you're assuming someone is being rational. If Donald Trump were rational, Thursday night a week ago, he would have come out and said, I've given a lot of thought to what we've done and I can't go any further. Military power is the wrong instrument to solve this problem. So I am disengaging our forces from active combat against Iran. We are going to seek out intermediaries that can bring us together and hopefully find a resolution. Well, why didn't he do that? Because he is hostage to Israeli demands and to the demands that Israel's agents in the United States are making. And their demand is very straightforward. First, they wanted regime change. Regime change failed. Having failed to achieve regime change, you then set out to do what? Destroy Iran. Well, we discovered we didn't have enough to do that.
It is precisely that gap between expectation and reality that makes MacGregor believe the danger of escalation remains very high. In modern wars, the most dangerous moment is not when the stronger side wins quickly. The most dangerous moment is when the stronger side enters the conflict believing it will win quickly, only to then discover that the opponent is still standing. Because at that point, their choices are usually not limited to the simple options of winning or withdrawing. There is often a third option. And it is also the riskiest one, escalating, in order to salvage a plan that is slipping off course. MacGregor seems to be looking at that point directly. He argues that when the first strike fails to produce the desired effect, Washington may not choose to step back right away. On the contrary, Washington may be pulled deeper into the familiar logic of every military superpower. If it has not worked well enough, apply more force. If collapse has not happened, strike longer, deeper, wider. If the old target list was not enough, create a new one. If the previous campaign failed to break the opponent, then launch an even larger campaign and call it the decisive blow. That is why MacGregor does not see the ceasefire as evidence of control. He sees it as the evidence that the previous campaign failed to solve the problem Washington had set out to solve. And once the problem remains unsolved, the pressure does not disappear. It merely changes form. It shifts from pressure to act into pressure to prove that the action taken was not a mistake. At this point, we reach the second layer of analysis, and it is also the layer that makes MacGregor's argument far more unsettling. That is the issue of Donald Trump's political psychology. According to MacGregor, Trump is not the kind of leader who responds to crisis in a cold, dry, purely rational way. He sees Trump as a politician who acts strongly on instinct, on the feeling of being challenged, on the need to control his image, and on that obsession of preserving the posture of a winner. In other words, in MacGregor's view, Trump does not make decisions simply as a president. He also makes decisions as a man who is slightly or highly sensitive to being seen as weak, outplayed, or forced into retreat.
Let's talk about Donald Trump for a moment. Donald Trump lives and dies by his mentor's 3 rules of life. His mentor, the man who seems to have had more influence over shaping the character and mentality of Donald Trump than anybody else, is a man named Roy Cohn. Now, what did Roy Cohn impart to Donald Trump? What are the 3 rules? Rule number 1, attack, attack, attack. In other words, be on the offensive. From the moment you recognize that you're in competition or in a contest of power, in any sort of conflict, you attack, attack, attack. Okay, secondly, what do? You deny, deny, deny. In other words, whatever you're accused of, true or not, whatever they say about you, good or bad, especially if it's bad, obviously, you deny, deny, deny. You never admit anything. And then finally, what do? You twist whatever the outcome turns out to be into some form of victory for you personally. Now, those are the 3 basic rules that govern the way Donald Trump thinks. You've listened to him. He can turn to an absolute unmitigated disaster and convince everybody in the room that this is actually a big success story, big throw. He was a gambler. Donald Trump is by nature a gambler. This is a man who has been bankrupt 6 times in his life, declared bankruptcy. Good Lord. How do you manage such a thing? That's almost a business model for him. So he'll gamble one more time. And if it doesn't work, well, then, I'll go out and I'll figure out a way to put a happy face on the dead rat. Well, I thought of myself as a physician, that I was healing things. Oh, come on.
That is an enormous difference. Because if a leader calculates only in terms of pure strategic interest, that leader may accept that a campaign which fails to go as planned should be stopped. That leader may step back in order to avoid deeper entanglement. That leader may choose tactical concession in order to preserve long-term interests. But if that same leader feels that stepping back would mean admitting that he was deceived or misled, or worse, humiliated on the international stage, then the decision is no longer purely strategic. It becomes a psychological reaction. And MacGregor believes Trump is exactly the kind of person who is highly likely to react that way. If Trump was persuaded that one quick strike could change the entire situation, yet the situation failed to move in the desired direction, then his first feeling would likely not be calm reassessment. His first feeling may instead be discomfort. The discomfort of being dragged into a game that cannot yet end with a clear image of victory. The discomfort of being forced into facing the reality that American power, however immense, still does not automatically produce the result he once expected. For someone who places enormous weight on image and political legacy, that is an extremely hard position to accept. MacGregor therefore sees a dangerous motive. When Trump cannot leave the chessboard in the posture of a winner, he may choose to strike once more in order to create the feeling of victory. In other words, the next attack, if it happens, may not come only from military calculation. It may come from the need to contain political damage, from a need to shift the narrative, from a need to prove that the original decision was not a mistake. And in politics, especially for a figure like Trump, looking like you are winning can sometimes matter just as much as, or even more than, actually winning. That is why MacGregor pushes the analysis beyond the battlefield. He is not speaking only about bombs, missiles, or military bases. He is talking about the motives of the decision maker. And once those motives become mixed with strategy, instinct, pride, and political pressure, the risk of escalation usually rises rather than falls. There's also another factor here that makes MacGregor's argument even more noteworthy. He does not believe US policy on Iran is being guided entirely by classical national interest calculations. He argues that behind the decision to strike lies heavy political pressure, especially from interests tied to Israel.
We would never have attacked Iran. Why did we attack Iran? We attacked Iran because Israel and its agents in the United States, worth billions of dollars, demanded that Trump attack Iran because he is hostage to Israeli demands and to the demands that Israel's agents in the United States are making. And their demand is very straightforward. First,
and from expectations that America must act harder, faster, more decisively. Whether one agrees with him or not, the key point here is this. In MacGregor's view, Trump is not making decisions in a vacuum.
They are a dominant player. What does Mr. Netanyahu demand? When the vice president of the United States got up from the table in Islamabad and went outside to make a phone call, to whom did he speak? Well, we know that he spoke at least twice to Mr. Netanyahu. To whom is the vice president of the United States reporting? Is he reporting to Donald Trump? Did Donald Trump say anything about talking to either Witkoff or Kushner or Vance during the negotiations? I didn't hear anything. As far as I know, they went there with a very, very limited set of objectives. And those objectives were the same old demands that Mr. Netanyahu has been making. There seems to have been some discussion about enriched uranium and how that might be altered. But then we also know there was a blow-up during the discussions. And Witkoff and Kushner stood up and threatened to leave the negotiations. That's off the table. Now, I don't know specifically what it referred to, but I suspect it probably had something to do with enriched uranium. My point to you is, who is in charge of American foreign and defense policy at this point?
He is making decisions in an environment where stepping back can be seen as weakness, while escalation can be sold as decisiveness. That makes the option of striking again far more plausible. Because once a leader is surrounded by promises that just one more blow, just a slightly wider target set, just a little more firepower will suddenly tip the balance, then the pull of escalation is always extremely strong. It is especially strong when the decision maker already has a natural preference for moves that are forceful, fast, and highly symbolic. MacGregor seems to be warning precisely about that trap. A previous strike failed to produce enough effect. A temporary ceasefire appears. A power structure does not want to admit that it miscalculated. A president does not want to be seen as someone who entered the game only to stop halfway. And the political environment around him is always ready to push the message that just one more strike could turn the tide. When all of those pieces are put together, what emerges, in MacGregor's view, is a very clear logic of escalation. Not because victory is close at hand, but because victory is still too far away, while accepting that reality is too politically painful. And that is always the most dangerous moment. Modern history has shown that many wars do not escalate because the parties are fully confident. They escalate because those parties lack either the courage or the political freedom to admit that the original plan has failed. A limited strike does not deliver the result it was advertised to deliver. A hardline statement does not create the deterrent effect that was expected. A campaign that was promised to be quick, clean, and overwhelming begins to reveal limits that are very hard to hide. At that point, instead of stopping, the system often tends to pour in more resources. Not because the probability of victory has clearly risen, but because the symbolic value of not being allowed to lose becomes too great. MacGregor is saying that Iran may be exactly such a case. Under this logic, the more Trump feels that he has been placed in a position where he can still not declare victory, the greater the risk that he will launch an even stronger blow. Not because every strategic condition supports it, but because in the mind of the decision maker, one more strike may look like the last opportunity to rewrite the story, to turn an unfinished gamble into an ending that can be sold to the public as a victory, to prove that America still dominates, to prove that he is still the one controlling the tempo of the game, and to avoid the image of being dragged into a war only to withdraw quietly in the end. That is the most dramatic part of MacGregor's argument. He is not simply saying America may strike again. He is saying that there are political, psychological, and symbolic conditions that make striking again very attractive to Trump, even when the risks are extremely high. And once war begins to be driven not only by military objectives, but also by the need to salvage honor, reclaim initiative, and avoid being seen as the failed, then the next decisions are usually far more dangerous than the original one. Because at that point, people are no longer striking only to achieve an objective. They strike to erase the feeling of failure. They strike to repair the image. They strike to reclaim the narrative. And in history, escalations driven by that kind of psychology rarely stop at a merely sufficient level. If we follow MacGregor's reading all the way to its conclusion, then the message he is trying to send is very simple, but deeply frightening. A ceasefire does not mean the danger has passed. On the contrary, that pause itself may be the moment when Washington is considering a new strike, larger and deeper, with the hope that what failed to be an accomplishment in the previous round can be completed in the next one. The problem is that the more a war is fought in order to correct a mistake, the greater the price that mistake usually becomes. And that is why MacGregor believes Trump could still strike Iran again in the very near future. Now, if we accept MacGregor's assumption that Washington could return to attack Iran in the very near future, then the next question has to be, how would the United States strike? MacGregor's answer on this point is very decisive. He almost completely dismisses the possibility of a large-scale amphibious assault.
Now, when it comes to this business of invasion, I think it's absurd. Why are we using that word? If you don't have 1 million men under arms already stationed in the region.
Limited to one of the islands. Sorry, he didn't mean a full invasion, just limited to some of the islands. A limited ground operation.
I think that will be tried, unfortunately. Whether or not it succeeds depends entirely on how can they get in there. I mean, if you look at the current so-called blockade, the blockade is about 500 miles away from the Strait of Hormuz. So if you draw a line across the ocean from virtually the border between Iran and Pakistan over to the edge of Oman, that's about 500 miles out. That's where the blockade begins.
This is a very noteworthy detail because during periods of military crisis, the public imagination is often drawn towards very concrete images. Warships moving in, troops landing on islands, special forces seizing key positions, and then gradually expanding control on the ground. That is the kind of image that is easy to picture, easy to dramatize, and also easy to make many people believe that a superpower like the United States could absolutely do if it wanted to. But MacGregor says almost the opposite. According to him, If anyone is imagining a campaign in which the United States lands forces on islands, secures footholds near the Strait of Hormuz, and then builds a decisive military advantage from there, they are looking at a war through a static map, not through the reality of firepower and logistics.
Being detected, targeted, and ultimately hit. Once you're on the island, how do you protect anybody that you put there from the various systems available to strike the islands?
And this is exactly where his argument starts to become very sharp. On paper, capturing a few forward positions may sound reasonable. In ordinary thinking, whoever stands at the gateway to Hormuz has the advantage of controlling this vital shipping lane. But MacGregor argues that this way of thinking is far too simplistic, because in modern war, especially against an opponent like Iran, the issue is not where you plant the flag. The issue is how long you can hold that position. How can you protect it? How you resupply it? And most importantly, whether the price of maintaining it is truly proportional to the strategic value it actually delivers.
Of which I've never heard. Maybe directed energy weapons that have magical batteries that'll power them or something. You're not going to control anything. You're not going to have any impact. You're just putting targets out there. You're creating a larger target array for the Iranians.
In his logic, the answer is no. The first reason is logistics. This is the part that the public usually overlooks the most. Yet, it is the factor that decides survival in war. People often see bombs exploding, missiles flying, aircraft carriers moving, and assume that military power lies in the moment of launch. But for those who understand war, real power lies in the ability to sustain the tempo of operations day after day, week after week, in an environment where the enemy always retains the ability to disrupt that tempo. And according to MacGregor, that is exactly where the United States faces a difficult problem. Because Iran is not some target sitting right off the American coast. This is not Cuba. This is not a battlefield located only a few dozen or a few hundred kilometers from the main logistics base. Everything in this scenario unfolds very far from US territory, very far from Washington's main logistics axis, and inside a region where the opponent has enough means to strike at that deployment process. If you want to move forces in, you have to transport them. If you want to keep forces in place, you have to resupply them. If you want to protect those units, you have to build a layered air defense and defensive umbrella. If you want to turn an island or a small position into an operational launch platform, you need more than troops. You need radar. You need interception systems. You need ammunition. You need fuel. You need technical equipment. You need medical support. You need the ability to rotate troops and evacuate casualties when counterattacks begin. In other words, this is no longer just a matter of putting troops out there. It is a matter of building an entire floating war structure in a region where Iran can continuously track, threaten, and wear it down in the end. And that leads to the second reason. Iran has a missile deterrent zone that MacGregor believes is sufficient to make any amphibious assault concept extremely dangerous. This is the central point in how he sees the battlefield. MacGregor does not believe Iran needs to go out to sea and confront the US Navy symmetrically in order to create real impact. He argues that the mere fact that Iran can disperse missiles, drones, and other strike systems across its own territory is already enough to turn the entire area around Hormuz into a high-risk kill zone. Put more simply, the United States may be vastly stronger if you compare weapon category to weapon category, fleet to fleet, squadron to squadron. But that does not mean the United States can deploy forces at close range and operate as if it were in a safe environment. As long as Iran can maintain the ability to detect, lock targets, launch fire, and inflict steady damage, then any force trying to hold an island or a forward position will live under a constant threat. A helicopter landing zone, a fuel depot, a radar station, an air defense battery, a resupply ship, all of them can become targets. And when you have to commit an enormous amount of military assets just to keep a small position from being destroyed, the question immediately returns. Are you controlling the situation? Or are you placing yourself inside a trap of attrition? MacGregor leans towards the second answer. He argues that capturing an island or a few key positions would not actually allow the United States to control Hormuz in the strategic sense, because the strait is not decided merely by who has troops standing in the nearby ground. It is decided by something less visible, but far more real: firepower risk and economic risk. This is an excellent argument to unpack. In MacGregor's view, there are two things that truly control Hormuz.
Hormuz is controlled. One is by Lloyd's of London and the inability of anybody to get insurance underwriters to support them who are sitting in the Gulf right now. The second way is to have tactical ballistic missiles, unmanned systems that are all over Iran, dispersed throughout the country, to essentially focus their firepower on ships that might try to go through the Strait of Hormuz.
The first one is the ability to threaten shipping with missiles, drones, and dispersed attack systems. The second is market psychology, specifically maritime insurance. The willingness of shipping companies to accept risk and the fear of losing ships, cargo, and trade access. To put it bluntly, you do not need to stand there with a loudspeaker ordering ships to stop in order to control Hormuz. As long as every ship owner, every insurance company, and every oil trader understands that passing through this area could mean being hit, sunk, denied insurance, or losing everything, then that route has already been strangled in practical terms. And that is why MacGregor believes the idea of using infantry or Marines to gain control of Hormuz is flawed at the root.
Stop or we'll shoot. It's not necessary. Everybody knows if you go up there and you don't have permission to go through there from the Iranians, you're going to be targeted and your vessel will be destroyed. So that's how you control the Strait of Hormuz. Putting somebody on the ground on a couple of islands, unless they have extraordinary capabilities of which I've never heard, maybe directed energy weapons that have magical batteries that'll power them or something, you're not going to control anything. You're not going to have any impact. You're just putting targets out there. You're creating a larger target array for the Iranians.
You may be able to seize ground, but by doing so, you cannot erase Iran's ability to turn the entire area into a risk equation that becomes unacceptable. For that reason, if the United States truly escalates, MacGregor believes the far more realistic scenario will not be an amphibious landing, but a high-intensity standoff campaign. So, what does that mean?
And that massive air and missile attack will last, in terms of intensity, for several days. This, he hopes, will break Iran effectively, break the state, break the economy, break the society. Trying to be the final solution for Iran, to utterly obliterate the country. Remember when he said he was going to bomb people into the Stone Age? That was a sort of silly way of saying it, but nevertheless, that's what he meant. And that's what you're going to see now, an effort to cause the disintegration of the Iranian state. Before, I've dealt with the Navy, and they are very good at amassing firepower. And if you're not too concerned about how much damage you do, in other words, collateral damage, and I don't think they are, then I think it's possible to do enormous, almost fatal damage to the Iranian state.
It means wide area airstrikes. It means missiles. It means hitting military infrastructure, energy infrastructure, command and control targets, stockpiles, launch sites, logistic networks, and whatever Washington believes forms the backbone of Iran's deterrent power. This is the way the United States usually responds when it does not want to fall into a long infantry war, but still wants to create decisive impact. The United States has too great an advantage in air-delivered firepower, cruise missile, surveillance capability, and target selection not to use that advantage as its main instrument in any escalation scenario. MacGregor understands that very clearly. He does not deny at all that the United States could inflict extremely severe damage. In fact, quite the opposite. He acknowledges that if Washington pours in more firepower, if the target list is expanded, if the limits on acceptable destruction are loosened, then Iran could suffer very heavy losses. Infrastructure could be partially paralyzed. Military capability could be eroded. The economy could be struck at its most sensitive points. Social and psychological pressure could increase. This would not be a symbolic strike if the United States strikes again. It would most likely be a real effort to inflict real damage on a real scale and large enough to create the impression that Washington is trying to finish what the previous round of attacks failed to complete. But this is exactly where MacGregor delivers his most important rebuttal. Firepower does not equal strategy.
Of this list, we will hit all of these targets. This is always the false promise of air campaigns. We've got the right targets now. Targets do not equate to a strategy, but in the airman's world, targets are the strategy. So I think we're going to do that. And it's sort of like the German offensive into the Ardennes in December 1944. The generals told Hitler, this is ridiculous. This will not work. We don't have enough fuel. And he decided that he wanted to launch it anywhere.
This may sound like a simple sentence, but when unpacked properly, it is almost the backbone of the entire analysis. A military superpower may be very skilled at generating target lists. It may be able to identify which site is a missile depot, which is a command center, which is a logistics route, and which is a critical infrastructure node. It may have enough technology to track, hit, strike quickly, and strike accurately. But all of that still does not answer the biggest question in war. What are you striking for? And after the strikes are over, what exactly will change in a sustainable direction that benefits you? According to MacGregor, this is the classic trap of air campaigns. When there is no clear political roadmap, no clear strategic design for the post-strike environment, then the system can easily fall into the illusion that the more targets it has, the closer victory must be. But reality does not work that way. A target list does not automatically create a political outcome. Destroying one more warehouse, one more radar station, one more command node does not necessarily make the opponent accept retreat on your terms. Worse, it may make the opponent more stubborn, more deeply dispersed, more enduring, and more capable of shifting the war into a form of attrition that the side initiating escalation cannot control or conclude on its own timeline. This is where the gamble becomes truly dangerous. The United States may be able to inflict enormous losses on Iran.
But I don't think it'll work at the same time. In other words, you understand my position.
Yeah, I do. I'm going to ask you questions on the full statement. So you asked if we were rational, we would not have attacked Iran.
That is entirely possible. But inflicting enormous losses does not mean breaking Iran. Damaging infrastructure does not mean collapsing the will to fight. Disrupting the military apparatus does not mean completely destroying retaliatory capability. And destroying more does not mean moving closer to a stable outcome. MacGregor is saying that Washington may possess every tool needed to create destruction, yet still have no guarantee that this destruction can be converted into a strategic victory. This is especially dangerous in the case of Iran, because Iran does not need to defeat the United States in the traditional sense in order to impose costs on it. Iran only needs to survive, retain enough retaliatory capacity to keep hurting, to keep Hormuz as a permanent point of instability, and prolong the crisis long enough for the energy market, supply chains, diplomatic pressure, and political fatigue to begin pushing back against Washington and its allies. In other words, the asymmetry here does not lie only in weapons. It lies in the definition of victory. The United States may enter a new round of escalation with the expectation of destroying, overwhelming, and forcing the opponent into submission. Iran may only need to enter that round with a much simpler objective. Do not break. Do not collapse. Do not lose retaliatory capacity, and make the cost of the campaign rise over time. If the game is dragged into that logic, then the longer the strikes continue, the more Washington faces an uncomfortable paradox. Military power is still there, but control over the final outcome becomes increasingly blurred. That is when risk begins to move beyond control, because war is only truly under control when the side initiating escalation still controls both the tempo and the stopping point. But when you may be able to start very powerfully, yet are no longer sure where it stops, no longer sure how the opponent will react, no longer sure how global markets will respond, and no longer sure how long allies can absorb the cost, then even the greatest firepower advantage begins to resemble a double-edged sword. That is why this section of MacGregor's analysis is not optimistic at all. Even though he acknowledges America's destructive power, he is saying something much harder to hear. Washington may be able to strike very painfully, very broadly, and very violently, yet still fail to achieve what it wants. And once the next round of escalation has opened, the cost of failing to achieve what it wants will be far greater than in the previous round. Because at that point, the story is no longer about a limited campaign. It becomes a test of credibility, of deterrence, of the energy market, of the regional security structure, and of America's very ability to impose outcomes on its own terms. That is truly the frightening part. Not that the United States is not strong enough to destroy, but that it may be very strong at destruction while still not strong enough to turn that destruction into a favorable and durable order. And in wars like that, the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to turn back. If we look at this confrontation only as a military clash between the United States and Iran, we will miss the most important part. Because according to Douglas MacGregor, the real impact of a new round of escalation does not lie in the number of targets destroyed, does not lie in how much additional military equipment either side loses, and does not lie in the first few days of the campaign. The real impact lies in the fact that such a war could shake one of the most important strategic choke points in the modern world, the Strait of Hormuz. Hormuz is not an unfamiliar name to those who follow geopolitics, but in normal times, people can easily forget just how important it really is. Only when war moves close to this area does the world suddenly realize that there are points on the map that look very small, yet function like little pressure valves attached to the entire global economy. Hormuz is exactly such a place. For MacGregor, this strait is not just a shipping lane, it's a point of life and death. Why? Because energy passes through it. Because oil passes through it. Because every major economy from Asia to Europe has vital interest tied to keeping this route open, predictable, and safe enough for businesses to continue operating normally. Once war drags on around this area, the chain reaction is almost impossible to avoid. First comes oil. In crises like these, The market does not wait until ships are being sunk in large numbers before reacting. The market reacts as soon as it senses risk. The moment the probability of supply disruption rises, the moment there are signs that energy shipments may face delays, interruptions, or danger, oil prices will swing sharply. And once oil prices move violently, this is no longer just a story for investors or energy corporations. It begins to seep into every corner of economic life. Transport, electricity, production, food, inflation, interest rates, growth, all of this is affected. In other words, a prolonged war with Iran would not only shake the Middle East, it would hit the pockets of ordinary people thousands of miles away.
These things are saying we cannot have another war. This is the most unpopular war in I don't know how many decades in the US, and the global economy cannot sustain another war, from helium to the microchips to oil to the fertilizers. Japan, South Korea, Pakistan, India, China, Europe, everyone's going to come together and pressure Trump. Eventually something will, and even when you put legacy into the mix, we both agree, and what you've warned about even before the war, that will be militarily disastrous. That is the outcome.
But oil prices are just the first layer. The second layer is maritime shipping. In the modern world, global trade operates on an unspoken assumption. Goods will move on schedule at an acceptable level of risk. Once that assumption is broken at a major choke point like Hormuz, the impact does not stop with energy. It spreads across the entire logistics system. Ships have to reroute. Delivery times are extended. Fuel costs rise. The probability of delays increases. And supply chains that are already strained after years of global instability come under even more pressure. Then comes the third layer, the one MacGregor emphasizes especially strongly: maritime insurance.
They're nuts. They're nuts. We're going to see $200 a barrel of oil pretty soon. Oh, no, we're going to win. Donald Trump's going to open the Strait of Hormuz. Everything's going to resume normality. Even if it resumed normality, the price is going to rise.
Now, this is very important detail because it shows that modern war is not only decided by bombs and missiles, but also by financial mechanisms and by the market's tolerance for risk. A sea route does not have to be fully blockaded to become useless. Sometimes, all it takes is for insurance costs to surge, or worse, for insurers to stop accepting the risk altogether. And that route has already been neutralized in practice. MacGregor is looking at this logic. He argues that controlling Hormuz is not simply a matter of who has more ships, who has more troops, or even who stands on which island. Real control comes from who can make the opponent and the market itself believe that passing through it is simply too dangerous. Once the risk becomes impossible to price in a normal way, commercial activity will begin to shrink on its own. Ship owners hesitate. Investors hesitate. Businesses begin preparing defensive scenarios. And just like that, the economic shock has already been activated. This is the point where the global supply chain begins to be choked.
We've destroyed the supply chain. I was talking to my friends in India and I said, you've got an extension cord. The extension cord runs from the Persian Gulf 1,000 kilometers to Mumbai. That's being cut. What does this mean? Well, they're rationing cooking oil.
We are living in a world where every major system is interconnected. Unstable energy drives up transport costs. Higher transport costs push up production costs. Rising production costs affects industry, agriculture, technology, and consumption. Economies that depend on imported energy will be hit harder. Countries already weakened by multiple consecutive shocks will face an even greater pressure. Major producing states in Asia, especially those dependent on a stable energy flow, will be forced to recalculate from the level of government all the way down to the level of business. That is why, in MacGregor's view, the consequences of a prolonged war do not stop at the Middle Eastern battlefield. They enter factories, ports, warehouses, gasoline prices, food prices, and the government balance sheets.
That's where it is. And
What about China? Don't they have much say in all this?
And that is when the question becomes much more uncomfortable. Who is really being weakened by this war? According to MacGregor, the answer may not be Iran alone. He argues that if Washington continues driving deeper into a new cycle of escalation, the United States risks weakening itself.
We are destroying ourselves. We are destroying not just our reputation, we're destroying our own prosperity. So you're going to see a reining in of many things now in the United States. And we're going into a deep recession. I don't think much of the global South can avoid a depression at this stage. So it's obvious everything's transactional for Donald Trump.
Now that may sound paradoxical. How could the world's strongest military superpower weaken itself by using military power? But that is exactly the larger point of his argument. Military power does not exist separately from the economy, from the international standing, from allied confidence, or from the ability to sustain long-term influence. If a war creates an energy price shock, exhausts partners, strains markets, drains resources, and exposes the limits of America's ability to impose order, then even if the United States is still firing the hardest, Washington may still walk away from the conflict in a weaker strategic position. That is a very dangerous kind of weakness. Not the kind that comes from a clear military defeat, but the kind that erodes credibility, reliability, and the ability to make other countries believe that the United States still controls the board. Once allies begin to worry that Washington's decisions could drag the whole system into instability, they will begin thinking about alternatives. Once adversaries see that simply prolonging the game is enough to impose heavy costs on the United States, they will have even more incentive to endure. And once the rest of the world realizes that an American war can create enormous costs for everyone, the demand for alternative centers of power and security will begin to rise. That is exactly where MacGregor shifts the analysis from regional war to a bigger story, the global transfer of power. According to him, the West no longer stands in the secure position it once did. American influence is still enormous, but no longer absolute. The ability to strike remains superior, but the ability to determine the outcome is no longer simple. And while Washington may be trying to demonstrate strength through firepower, that very process may be accelerating a trend that MacGregor believes had already begun long before. The center of power is gradually shifting towards Asia.
And from Europe, it went to North America. What I said several months ago was that I see the trend is now reversing. The trend in terms of power, technology, wealth, gold, silver, rare earths, everything else, that is moving towards Asia. Asia is the new powerhouse.
This is the most important big picture layer. Because if that is true, then the war with Iran is not merely an isolated crisis. It may be a symptom of a much larger transition, in which the old order is still strong enough to react, but no longer secure enough to freeze the world according to its own will. In that picture, MacGregor believes that there are several actors that could benefit in the long run. If American influence continues to decline, the first is Iran. At first glance, that may sound hard to believe, because Iran is clearly the side under direct military pressure. But in a geopolitical logic, a country does not have to avoid every loss in order to emerge stronger in position. If Iran survives an enormous pressure campaign, preserves the core of the state, maintains a deterrent capability strong enough to remain frightening, enforces the world to admit that Tehran cannot be easily broken by firepower, then the mere act of standing firm becomes a form of strategic victory. Next up comes Turkey. MacGregor sees Ankara as an underestimated factor.
They have the largest army in NATO. They can put 2 million men into the field in a little over a month. They have modern technology, modern air forces, modern missiles, modern navy. They've got all the instruments of power, and they are waiting patiently on the sidelines. They have sent many, many warnings to the Israelis, and they now confront the Israelis in Syria, which historically they consider to be their territory.
While many eyes are fixed on the United States, Iran, Israel, or China, Turkey stands out as a regional power with a strong military, a favorable strategic position, and a formidable ability to wait for the right moment. If the old order of the Middle East begins to shake, if American influence contracts, if post-war power structures have to be rewritten, Ankara could absolutely emerge as one of the biggest players. Then come China and India.
Turkey is going to be a huge winner because it's preserved all of its military power and capability. And it will be on the winning side regardless of what happens because we're leaving.
MacGregor does not see Asia as a region merely affected by the energy crisis. He sees it as a center of rising global power, production, technology, trade. While the West becomes absorbed in costly strategic crises, Asian countries may endure short-term pressure while also using the moment to help shape a new long-term order. China in particular gains an advantage if the United States continues to scatter its resources and credibility. India as well has a growing center of population, production, and influence. Of course, MacGregor is not saying that these countries will immediately score huge victories in the middle of the crisis. What he is emphasizing is this: in a world where the West wears itself down through ever more expensive cycles of escalation, other centers of power will have more space to rise. And that is the true meaning of this war in his eyes. This is not only a question of whether the United States will strike again. It is a test of how durable the old order still is. Can the United States still use military power to preserve an irreplaceable role the way it once did? Are allies still willing to follow Washington through every cycle of escalation? Can the global economic system still withstand shocks triggered by old-style geopolitical decision-making? And are emerging powers waiting for exactly this moment to move into the vacuum? If we follow MacGregor's reading, the answers are beginning to appear in a deeply unsettling direction. The West is weaker than many people think. American influence is thinner than people still say. The Middle East is far more unstable than it appears on the surface. And what is happening around Iran may not be an exception, but a sign that the entire order, once treated as the default for decades, is beginning to crack. That is why the most frightening part of this confrontation does not lie in the image of missiles leaving their launchers. It lies in the possibility that after this crisis, the world may enter a different condition. A condition in which the United States is still very strong, but no longer strong enough to impose outcomes the way it once did. A condition in which the Middle East does not return to its old pattern. A condition in which Asia rises faster while the West pays the price for its own escalations. In a condition in which a war that appears to revolve only around Iran ultimately becomes a mirror reflecting the turning of an entire area. If Douglas MacGregor is right, then what the world is facing is not just another round of American airstrikes on Iran. It could be a new escalation, large enough to reshape the entire Middle East for many years to come. Because at this point, the story is no longer about how many bombs one side can drop, how many missiles it can launch, or how many more targets it can destroy. The bigger story lies here. Every time the ladder of war is pushed one step higher, the strategic price also rises with it. And sometimes, the side with the greatest firepower is not the side that controls the long-term consequences. That is the central paradox in MacGregor's entire argument. The United States may still be the most powerful military force in the world. The United States may be capable of inflicting enormous destruction. The United States may expand its target list, intensify airstrikes, and push its opponent into a state of severe attrition. But the more aggressively military power is used, the greater the strategic cost can sometimes become. It can drive oil prices even higher. It can turn Hormuz into an even more dangerous choke point. It can prolong instability in supply chains. It can leave allies more exhausted. It can make adversaries realize that if they can simply hold out long enough, they too can force Washington to pay a price. And worst of all, it can accelerate a process many people once did not want to believe was happening: the relative decline of American influence, while other centers of power quietly rise. So, in the end, the biggest question is no longer whether Trump will strike again. The real question is Trump preparing for a decisive victory? Or is he stepping into a gamble whose consequences even the United States may no longer be able to control? Because history has always followed one very cold rule. Many wars begin with the belief that a stronger blow will break the deadlock. But a stronger blow does not always create a new order. Sometimes it only destroys what little stability remains of the old one. And if that is what is happening in Iran, then after this crisis, what disappears may not be only a ceasefire. It may be the illusion that the Middle East can return to what it once was.